everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to this panel discussion on the role of values and emotions in international relations, which is really, of course, a growing field of research, but also I think highly relevant. I'm very pleased that it's growing. We've got three wonderful speakers. All of our speakers are always wonderful, and these three are no exception. And I would like to introduce them briefly before we get stuck into the meat of the discussion. So first we have Dr. Andrei Tsygankov, who I know that many of you have already met for his wonderful lectures on the history of Russian foreign policy. He is a professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at San Francisco State University. We're also joined, he's joining us from Moscow. We're also joined from Berlin by Regina Elsner, who's a theologian and since September 2017 has been a researcher at the Center for East European Studies, often commonly known as ZOIS, in Berlin. And then we're also joined from New Jersey by Dr. Zheng Wang, who's the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies and a professor in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University in the US. So thank you all for joining us and of course for agreeing to this. So as a kind of standard practice on the Monterey Symposium, just for the fellows' knowledge, we will have around 45 minutes of discussion and then around 45 minutes as well for Q&A, so that everybody, well, hopefully everybody has a chance to read their, to ask their questions. So let's start. Rather than start with introductory statements, I thought we'd kind of get straight into the discussion. And I'd like to start with you, Andrei, and you've written about the role of dignity within Russian foreign policy. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on this and how it impacts on which historical events Russia, well, not Russia remembers, but perhaps the political elites or the media choose to remember, and how they frame those.
It's a great question. Of course, it's a broad one. So it's appropriate that we start with the notion of dignity. Dignity, of course, can be defined in multiple ways. Sometimes it's a synonym of honor. It includes internal and external dimensions. I think it's appropriate that we first define, at least have a rough working definition of what dignity is. And I think it might be viewed as simply self-respect attitude. It's something that all nations have. Sometimes they define it as status, sometimes they define it in terms of internal system of values. But it has basically this notion of self-respect, basically has two dimensions. One is internal, while the other one is external. And internally, it speaks to the idea of freedom. All nations have some idea of freedom, some notion of either social or political freedom, and they, of course, vary greatly. And the other dimension here is justice. So both freedom and justice are present. Social justice, in Russia's case, both the notion of social justice and the notion of spiritual freedom, if you will, have some roots historically in Orthodox Christianity, in the idea of egalitarian justice that goes back centuries. And then, of course, there is external dimension, which is also fundamental. And that includes multiple dimensions, such as status, reputation. I might also use the notion of sphere of influence that most states, at least large states, great powers have. Sometimes it's simply the idea of delineating your own cultural area of responsibility. Sometimes it's protecting your interests. And of course, the notion of status, equality in the international system hierarchy is essential here as well. And we can, of course, find multiple examples that Russians illustrate these concepts with. You can reach as far back as to the 15th and 16th century Russia's multiple conflicts with neighbors, Western and Eastern, I think Turkey in particular. Or you can go back to the 19th century, the Crimean War, you can go back to the Cold War. And of course, right now we are all trying to make sense of the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine. And it's very much about these values as well. And what makes it even more complicated is that there is ultimately very heavy emotional involvement, very heavy emotional side to it, because you cannot speak about honor and self-respect without involving emotions. And these emotions, when we speak of conflicts, typically you can think of frustration, you can think of anger, and they are on display in this war as well. The alternative explanation here is, of course, that it has to do with rational considerations. It has to do with what really is defined as national interests, that Russia is trying to promote and defend its national interests in the eastern Ukraine, whereas the United States is trying to defend its own national interests. And of course, Ukraine is doing the same. The problem is that this is where you run into multiple difficulties by trying to apply rational explanations, as it doesn't seem particularly rational. If you think about Russia, for example, it's certainly far more rational at this point to look for a ceasefire. And it's not rational, I would argue, in the first place to start this war, given all the devastation, given all the complications that Russia is going to have now in terms of its reputation in the international system, and so forth and so on. It's not rational for the West to continue the path that it is on right now. It would have been more rational to encourage some sort of ceasefire negotiations at this point, some settlement, and it's not happening either. And I would argue it's not rational if you are Ukraine as well, because you're likely to face even more devastation, even more destruction going forward without looking for some sort of a ceasefire. And there was even an opportunity for that ceasefire that was lost in Istanbul in March. So I think we are actually going to explain this more by these notions of self-perceived dignity, respect, and the idea of status. Russia, the West in particular, Ukraine too, to a great extent, is fighting for dignity, is fighting for honor. And because Russia and the West are both viewing themselves as essential stakeholders in the international system, they are fighting for the world order. To Russia, it's existential because it's close, but also because Russia sees itself as fundamentally changing the world order towards more multipolar, which it views as more just, more stable than the US-centered unipolarity. And to Joe Biden, to the United States policymakers, it's fundamentally about their own West-centered, rule-based world order that Russia is violating. So to some extent, this is also existential to them. Not in the same way as it is to Russia, but still is fundamentally existential. And that explains the bitterness of this. That explains the emotional bitterness on both sides. That explains the language that is used by both sides. That explains all the complications to arrive at a ceasefire. That explains lack of desire on all sides to engage in rational settlement, in rational search for negotiations. So that actually makes things far more complicated. We can go on, I can certainly elaborate on other cases, but that is certainly a way to understand the conflict. And a way out, I think, is through searching for some sort of a compromise in which there will be limited recognition to the extent possible, extended by all sides, and perhaps trying to identify some ways to adjust your status, because there is an expression in international relations that is applicable here. It's status anxiety. So both Russia and the United States are to a great extent influenced and driven by the status anxiety. And that applies to Ukraine as well, which sees itself as a central nation state defending its own territory, its own ground, and therefore unwilling to compromise. I can go on, but I'd rather stop here. Thank you, Jake.
That's a nice place to stop, but that was genuinely a really excellent answer. And I think it leads quite nicely into the next question, which I have for Zheng, which is about how, I suppose, on the flip side, not just the search for dignity and for honor, but how, if we invert that, how sort of national humiliation works as a powerful lever or a powerful push within international relations, and whether or not it necessarily encourages an aggressive foreign policy or at least an incredibly defensive one. And I know, Zheng, of course, you've literally written the book on this in relation to China and Chinese politics. So it'd be good to hear your thoughts.
Good morning, good afternoon. So I'm very happy to join today's discussion. I think it's a very interesting question. But I just think that for many of my international relation colleagues, this is a question they probably feel quite uncomfortable to discuss about emotion. Because when we talk about emotion, what kind of role emotion plays in foreign policy, in a group of people's decision making at the international level? I think many of the mainstream IR scholars, they probably, like I said, they probably think this is, of course, it may play some role, but not playing a major role. The reason I believe many IR scholars feel uncomfortable to discuss about emotions because one of the foundations of many theories of international relations actually has been built on the foundation of rationality. Because we believe people's leaders, decision makers, they are rational. That's somehow it's like a precondition for us to think about international relations and foreign policy. So you can think about a long list of theories like realism, rational choice theory, a long list of theories. They are based on rationality. Because we believe people, decision makers, they are rational. State leaders, they are rational. They make rational choice. Of course, emotions may matter, but if you ask a realist, what kind of role emotion play in international relations, I believe most of the realists probably will answer this question saying, oh, it's playing roles, but it's not playing a major role. Just like Jim mentioned about that, I wrote a book about I discussed about humiliation, what kind of role the humiliation plays in Chinese politics and foreign relations. I actually made an argument in this book that historic memory about national humiliation, that was a period of time during after the Opium War in 1840 until the end of World War II, this roughly 100 years, this period of time, the Chinese call it national humiliation. So I made the argument in my book that historic memory is one of the biggest driving force shaping China's foreign relations. So the reason I made this argument, this argument because humiliation is emotion, or it's the emotion that people feel that their status being lowered in front of others, right? That is humiliation. Humiliation is the emotion. So I somehow made the argument, I believe many of the mainstream realists would feel uncomfortable to hear about, or they would disagree. How could you say humiliation becomes a major driving force of China's foreign relations? So I think I just want to make this kind of like, because I think we talk about a very interesting question. So I think I want to introduce you why I have this kind of, or made this kind of argument. I think in my book, the title of the book is Never Forget National Humiliation. What I'm trying to do, because when I wrote this book, I got a lot of feedback or questions regarding about whether I probably asked the wrong question. Because this book is based on my dissertation research. So when you write a dissertation paper, you got a lot of questions about your methodology. So at that time, I believe I still remember I spoke with people, I interviewed people. When I talk about historical memory, I got the feedback is basically saying, because I'm trying to argue that China's behavior in several international conflicts, especially with the United States. You probably heard about the bombing of the embassy in 1999 and the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-99. So I made the argument that historical memory played a very important role in China's behavior during these crises. I think the efforts I made in my book is I'm trying to make the argument that the sense of humiliation, a group of people, their feeling or their education about this national experience of humiliation becomes a very important part of material of constructing Chinese national identity. So I think that's my argument. I think that's the main point I want to introduce to you is that when we talk about emotion, when we talk about humiliation, it's not just about emotion. In the Chinese case, I believe the reason emotion, humiliation becomes important is it becomes a very important source of national identity, or it's being used to constructing contemporary Chinese national identity. Yeah. So that's my argument. And of course, this construction process is quite complicated. It's through the elite, to some extent, it's elite manipulated. Students went to school and received this education, and people normally believe what the textbooks telling them about what happened in the past. It's also passed by family stories. So like I often mentioned to my colleagues that during the World War II, during the war with Japan, that, a major part of China being occupied by Japan. So for many Chinese families, they have family stories passing from one generation to another generation. So that makes the humiliation becomes an important part of the national identity. And when it becomes a part of the national identity, we know that foreign policy is determined by a group of people, the leaders, the decision makers, their understanding about national interest. But the understanding of national interest determined or shaped by national identity. How do you understand your national objectives? What is important to your group? It's all determined by your national identity. So that's I think I'm just trying to introduce my research about the role of humiliation in Chinese foreign policy is because it's related with national identity construction. And also for this reason, for the current government, they has to be tough in the international relations, in the diplomacy, because being tough is a part of the legitimacy of the current government, because they trying to make people believe, especially the people at home, to believe that they are the liberator. They liberating China from the foreign powers. They are the defender of the China's national interest. So they need to be tough in dealing with, especially in dealing with anything related with sovereignty, national dignity. They need to be tough. So that's the reason we understand about like Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea. I think I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you. Just because you stopped on a point that's really quite useful, and I wanted to come on to ask Regina about, which is about this sort of the self-narrativization. And of course, all countries have narratives. All countries need to kind of make sense, I suppose, of who they are, why they belong together, why they exist. And of course, we all know that religion can play an outsized role in this. And I know Professor Macmillan's argued that that history kind of plays that role in secular societies. But let's go back to religion just for a second. And Regina, what role does religion, especially maybe the Russian Orthodox Church, play in Russia's self-narrativization? I know Andrei's already spoken to that bit, so it'd be interesting to hear your response to his insights and also your own views.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also very much for inviting me, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah, in fact, it is very much close to what the other speakers already also told us. And for the case of Russia, religion is very much interlinked with the historical questions. So we have here both come together, both factors of this identity building. In fact, I also think that identity is the key term in this discussion. So to understand the role of Russian Orthodoxy in this identity narratives in Russia, we of course have to look for history. And historically, Russian statehood, in fact, is deeply linked with Orthodoxy. So as you probably know, the Russian Orthodox tradition traces itself back to the baptism of Prince Volodymyr near Kiev in 988. And this was not only a religious act, it was an act of statehood building. It was in this Byzantine idea of symphonia, of symphonic cooperation of state and church, that the whole society at this moment, the Holy Rus at this moment was shaped. So the idea that the prince, then further the Tsar, was Orthodox and felt himself responsible for the church and for the individual salvation in a sense for all his inhabitants, all his people. This very much shaped the whole idea of history of Russia in the following centuries. So Russian identity was then in all those following centuries very much shaped by Orthodoxy, by this idea of cooperation, of harmonic getting together of the political and the ecclesial world. Even though, of course, there have been political leaders who tried to separate state and church. Think of Peter the Great, for example. But nevertheless, the church was always one of the main identity factors of the people and of a supporter of the statehood of Russia. And what is key in this development, that Russian Orthodoxy very much shaped also the idea of a special role or a special character of Russian people and of the Russian destiny. So you have here also the link to the dignity discussion, that Russia is special in world history, in world civilizations, because it has this messianic task to save Christianity. So you have this idea of the Third Rome, of being the inheritage of true Christianity in the world. You have these ideas of the Slavophiles, that Russia and Slavic civilization is something special in the world. And everything, all of these ideas are linked, of course, to Orthodoxy. So what we see today is the perpetuation of this idea that Orthodox Russian is special, is a special civilizational actor, and has a special mission to save something. And all of this was, of course, very much strengthened during the post-Soviet years, when the whole society was looking for who we are, where we go, what is our place in the world after communism ceased. And this is a crucial moment to understand why we have now this mixture of religious and political ideas, strategies, also in a geopolitical dimension. Maybe so far.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I wondered though if I could just ask you a little bit more about the political role of the Orthodox Church in Russia, which I know you've explained it quite neatly, kind of how this sort of state supportive role evolved. But I also wondered, for example, one of the questions that some people have had is sort of why the part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was still loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate, why the Russian Orthodox Church didn't really why they kind of chose, I suppose, to abandon them to fully support the war, and what maybe might be some of the potential consequences of decisions of some governments, particularly the UK, to sanction Patriarch Kirill and that sort of that politicization in another way.
Mm-hmm. These are very, very complex questions, in fact. But I think it's important to understand that the Russian Church always, for the last decades, and supported the imperial ideas of the Russian political elites. So geographically, for the Russian Orthodox Church, Ukraine and also Belarus are part of Russia, of a greater Russia, of the Rus, of this historical idea. And if you look at the sermons of Patriarch Kirill since the beginning, or the outbreak now of the war in February 22, you won't find any calls for going to war against Ukraine or for killing Ukrainians or something like that. The rhetoric is that they save and they defend Ukraine in this war. And they also defend and save their own Christian believers in Ukraine against those liberal values and gay parades and so on and so forth. So from their point of view, they are defending their own people, and the idea of sovereignty in a political sense, but also in an ecclesial sense, the idea that Ukrainian Orthodoxy could be independent from Russian Orthodoxy is not. They can't imagine even anything like this, and they won't support or even allow this to happen. Because if you look at this historical ideas, Russia just loses its own narrative of its statehood if it loses Kiev as this mystical place of the beginning of everything. So this is one of the aspects. The other aspect is that Patriarch Kirill has never accepted anything like church self-consciousness in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian believers, with their ideas that they are believers in a sovereign state, that they are part of a civil society of Ukraine, that they are not Russian, but they are Ukrainian. These ideas never occurred, in fact, to Kirill. Kirill is very much convinced that those people there feel themselves as Russians. And this is, of course, a huge mistake, and we see this in this ideas of now separating from Moscow, of the believers now trying to get away from Moscow in this very hard moment in their lives. But Moscow tries to communicate that for them nothing changed. In their view, they don't see those developments within Ukraine and try to avoid looking at them at all. And coming to the sanctions, which is a third part, I think those sanctions, in fact, are important against Kirill because they finally accept and show that European political leaders accept that Kirill is a political actor and not a religious actor. So to get those both levels, to separate them, is very important, because in fact, since the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church is acting as a soft power in Russian foreign politics, but always with the idea that the church is not political. The church is outside of politics. And so they saved their authority and their place in foreign politics as a church, but doing politics, in fact. And now sanctioning Kirill is at least acknowledgement that this is not true. They are not out of politics with what they are doing. On the opposite, they are doing very much soft power politics and influencing international politics. And so the sanctions are very much in place, and I really appreciate them, I have to say. Yeah, maybe stop here.
Thank you, Regina. I have to say, I don't think there's ever a session that I've moderated where I've taken so many notes myself. There's been so much, just so much. I mean, perhaps it's obviously because I find the topic interesting, but really I found this so insightful. So Zheng, if I could sort of say to you, we've been hearing there from Marina about sort of how a lot of the way in which the Russian Orthodox Church depicts the war is almost sort of as of course, as a defensive war, and in part against Western modernity, particularly maybe some of the more liberal or secular values. So we all remember the sort of the idea that it was a war against sort of gay parades, but to look a bit deeper and not kind of just on this level, of course, these narratives of sort of anti-colonialism or anti-hypocrisy or anti-American hegemony are all very powerful in Russia and China, and they're used by Russia and China. And you've spoken a bit about sort of why these narratives might appeal, but I wondered if I could ask you, and this is slightly different from the question we discussed, but why do you think that these sort of why doesn't the West understand that these anti-colonial and anti-hypocrisy narratives will appeal to much of the world, including Russia and China?
I think indeed, there's some similarity between China and Russia in terms of the Western narratives or anti-colonialism narratives. For China, because I think we have to think about China's encounters with the Western countries. If we look at a map of China, it's probably help us to better understand why China developed this kind of a very special attitudes towards the rest of the world, especially the Western world. China geographically being separated with all the Western countries by the geography barriers, whether it's ocean or desert Gobi, Himalaya. So it's very difficult in the past, in the ancient times, of course, their communication. We talked about Silk Road, we talked about the introduction of Buddhism into China, but this kind of interactions was quite limited in the ancient age. So Chinese civilization, to some extent, developed in a quite isolated situation. But China's first encounter with Western countries was not a romantic one, was not a good one, was quite violent and bloody. So, like Chinese narrative always mention about the Opium War, so the British gunboat opened the door of China. So for China, the first encounter, the real encounter with Western powers started by this narrative of national humiliation. The Western powers coming, they have much better weaponry system, they have a few thousands people, but they can conquer a large portion of China or enter into China without much resistance. So this has been the central part of the national humiliation narrative. So that also gives Chinese, this kind of narratives, especially for the government, for the elite, to use this narrative to mobilize people. So in my book, I made the argument, I said, this is China's master narrative. Most of countries, of course, there's many different kind of narrative populated in a group of people. But if there's master narrative, the master narrative is no longer just a narrative. It's to some extent, provide theories to a group of people. They use the master narrative to explain what happened in the past, and they use it to justify their behavior, their action, and what they want to achieve in the future. So that's my argument. The humiliation narrative is the master narrative. But I believe, going back to your question, I think that for many of today's people from the Western countries, sometimes they overlooked this part of the history. Just like I mentioned about China's first encounter with the outside world, especially the Western countries, was a very bad one, was bloody and violent. And this kind of historic memory, collective memory, has been for many years. It's not only just started from Communist Party, it's actually started from even before that. In my book, I mentioned about, for example, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the China during the World War II, and he has been, national humiliation was also a major narrative for him to provide it to his people and use to mobilize people. So it's not started just from Communist Party. Of course, it's today when people talk about today's Chinese politics, foreign relations, many people just blame the current regime's manipulation of historic narrative or history education. But of course, they're elite manipulation. But I always trying to convince my colleagues there's also strong, very strong, understanding and the supports even from the people. So that's also a reason, if it's propaganda, it's not so powerful. But look at today's the reality in China. So this is no longer just a narrative. It's go much beyond the narrative. So I think for I think the way you ask the question is very important. It's also all the the leaders of the especially from the Western countries, they need to understand about this and the complexity of that, rather than just a simple elite manipulation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that distinction. That's very helpful. Andrei, I want to come to you with the last question that perhaps moves us in a slightly more methodological direction before we open the questions up to the fellows. But how can we include values and narratives within international relations in a sort of a reliable and repeatable way? And I know this is something that you've done very successfully in your works. And I wondered if you could comment on some of the comments that Zheng made around sort of a certain IR sort of scholar resistance to incorporating sort of not so much narratives, but certainly emotion. Be good to hear.
Well, they don't fit. It's a good question, Jade, but they don't fit quite well with mainstream IR theories for various reasons. Part of it we have touched on already, and that's the notion of rationality. Most Western IR theories, and I'm specifically referring to Western IR theories here, even more particularly American IR theories, are based on the notion of rationality, rational interests, protected by states, advanced by state leaders. And of course, the key canon theory is realism. And realism values, unless you mean great powerness, the appreciation of material capabilities, prestige, and sovereignty, and things like that, unless you mean by values these notions, values are not really significant. But we mean something else by values here, right? We all talk about something that has to do with national identity, that has to do with religion, as Regina stressed, that has to do with the idea of justice. All these notions are superfluous in realist vocabulary, because what matters to them is how you're able to defend your turf, to defend your national interest, sovereignty, and therefore values are secondary. They are helpful only to the extent that they can protect these national interests, these ideas of sovereignty. They can help because states sometimes can mobilize those feelings when they're fighting, for example. They are mobilizing these notions of national humiliation, dishonor, or what have you. They present history in a particular way. They stress some dimensions. They underestimate other dimensions in history, all for the purpose of national mobilization. But that's different. That's not what we describe as value dimensions here. We talk about at least three different things. Jen is talking about structural dimension of values, national identity, master narrative. Regina, to some extent, describes the notion of missionary values as they have roots in Orthodox Christianity. I speak more to the idea of leaders' values, their mythologies. Putin might have made different decisions, but he made this decision because he was driven by certain ideas and myths about national identity in Ukraine. All of these are not really rational to the extent that realism describes rationality. So that's not a very good fit for studying emotions here, unless, again, you want to study power and national interests. But you will not learn very much about emotions and values if you are a realist. Liberals are quite different, but then again, the liberals, at least in my assessment of liberalism, Western liberalism, are quite ethnocentric. What they mean by values are typically one set of values, the so-called universal Western values that all other nations in the world, one way or another, will arrive at. And that's no way to understand others either, because you're simply projecting your own self on others. You're expecting others to become you instead of studying how these others are quite different from you. So that's not a very good starting point either. I think, if you are studying Western IR theory, if you're looking for a place to start for you, as I was looking for a place to start when I was PhD student 20 plus years ago, I could not really relate to any of these theories. I could not really find my home, theoretically speaking. I could not start my dissertation while being a PhD student until I found constructivism. And even then, I interpreted constructivism very liberally, because constructivism and the Western presentation of it also sometimes reduces itself to the notion of Western values, to the notion of values traveling across the world, as it is known in research by people such as Martha Finnemore about global values. But these values are rooted in the West. Research by sociologists, Peter Katzenstein and others. I could not relate to this research either for the same reasons, because they describe specifically the idea of norms as West-centered. Whereas the challenge for us is precisely to understand where China is coming from, where India is coming from, where Russia is coming from, what are their roots. And here, I think you asked earlier also, Jay, the question whether or not ontological security theory is a good fit. I think it's a better fit within constructivism, because if it does not spell out specifically the positive nature of these values. It calls us to understand the nature of these anxieties that we are experiencing, the nature of these uncertainties, sources of these uncertainties. And that's a great starting point, because once you ask this question, why is it that we feel uncertain in this world of late modernity, of postmodernity, depends how you define it, you are ready to engage with the question of national values, to engage with the questions of why some nations feels dishonored, whereas others feels connected with international system and its participants. So this is a great start, but it has to be complemented with the idea of sources of this uncertainty and anxiety. And one other point I will make here has to do with power, because I am also fascinated with the notion of power, how it is constructed in international relations theory. And it actually is one way or another, this notion informs all our theories. It informs realism in a rational way, quote unquote. It informs liberalism, because liberalism also speaks about power of particular political regimes. It tends to explain Vladimir Putin's behavior by his personality, by political regimes. That's a particular way of understanding power either. And in constructivism, it's all about how power is socially constructed and how it becomes part of identity. And this is where I think we are on a very solid ground. This is where we need to move forward. This is where perhaps to some extent it resonates with these theories of ontological security. I've used it in my work. I invite you also to consider this. And I think you will ultimately arrive at different trajectories, at different outcomes, but the starting point should be this kind of socially, sociologically defined theories rather than simply rationality. Because ultimately rationality, and this is where I will end, as Max Weber used to say, is simply a cultural construct. Okay, what's your rationality is not my rationality, and vice versa. Rationality is simply a way to pretend or to hide your own cultural values. So why don't we simply reveal those rather than hide them?
That's a great way to end. It feels quite dramatic. Also, just very quickly wanted to say thank you so much to all three speakers, because I genuinely really did learn a lot. I've taken a furious amount of notes.